Vineyard.
Somos Viña.
We are Vineyard.
I see people try that idea on, and it is so different from how they have been living. This mental model that if I'm a good leader, people are going to be happy and they're going to follow me willingly. To actually, if I'm a good leader, I'm going to provoke sabotage and resistance. That's a huge shift. It takes a while to even just try that on. And I use that language on purpose, to just try it on. Like you would walk around in a pair of shoes and see if they fit. Just try it on in meetings, try it on in your devotional time, try it on, when you're writing sermons, and just see, is there something here that fits? And if there is, then practice the idea that, I'm coming up against some resistance. Maybe this isn't personal. Maybe this is because the system is reacting to being challenged in a new way. And how can I see this through?
Welcome to the We Are Vineyard podcast, conversations to help us grow with Jesus and each other. This week's episode is a continuation of our Leadership Under Pressure series. In this episode, Jay will be talking with Trisha Taylor. Trisha is a counselor, author, and a consultant for the leader's journey. Let's listen in.
Well, Trisha, thanks for joining us for We Are Vineyard. I don't know. Have you listened to any of these? It's okay if you haven't.
Yes, back in the day. A while ago. It had a different name though, didn't it?
I don't know. Maybe. We had a different logo. For sure. So yeah, it keeps changing a bit, but
I have listened to podcasts associated with the Vineyard. How's that?
Okay. Well, that works. That's good. No pressure. I feel like I started with pressure. I didn't intend that. I was just curious. So you knew what it was. So we've known each other a long time.
A long time.
I was trying to do the math on that as I was thinking about this, because I think we had talked on the phone or Zoom a number of times, but then it was in the sort of recording of faith walking videos.
Right.
Because I think we spent the most amount of time together.
Yes, I remember showing up at that house, soaking wet because of rain, and trying to make videos, and it was just bananas.
Yeah, yes. It worked.
But we did it, and they still use those videos. So.
We do. We still use them because they're very, very good. You've done great work. So it'd be good to start with sort of some of your stories. So tell me where you were born and where you grew up. Let's just start because that's where all good stories start.
I'm a lifelong Texan. So, born in West Texas, raised some on the east side by the Gulf Coast, graduated from high school in Central Texas, back on the Gulf Coast. I'm a lifelong Texan.
And again, I claim ignorance here, but I don't hear like the strong Texan accent.
Yeah, people say that often, and I'm not sure. Like I haven't had, any lessons to erase my accent or anything. So
it's not on purpose. Okay.
Yeah, right. It's not on purpose.
Fair enough. And so here's the question that might solve that is, were your parents both from Texas?
They were both from Texas.
Really? Okay.
Parts.
I was going to guess no, because sometimes you don't pick up accents because your parents don't.
Both more from the west side.
Okay.
And so, mostly the Texas twang is East Texas.
Oh, okay.
And my people are not from East Texas. But my husband's people are from East Texas, and he doesn't have it either.
He doesn't have it either.
I don't know. I can't tell you.
Well, who knows? Okay.
Who knows?
And so you're born, you grow up in Texas. What did your folks do? What was their kind of main career? What did they do for a living?
Yeah, both my parents were educators, kind of in that Mr. Rogers model, from the 60s. Like we didn't watch much TV, didn't really participate a lot in the culture. It was very calm and creative for a long time in my family. And then my family adopted two very active young boys.
Oh,
and
really?
A lot of that changed. And then later we added a sister. So there became four of us. So I grew up in a family up until about age 7 or 8 that looked one way. And then we opened the door to the chaos of 4 kids in our family after that.
Wow, that's a cool story. And was that out of kind of a Christian conviction? Was that like they felt maybe God wants us to do this, or what sort of led them to that?
I think it was partly wanting to complete their family and partly very much, yes, wanting to be part of a solution for for kids in foster care and so forth. And so, yeah, I think it was both those things.
That's cool.
I came home from school one day and there they were. And so we went in one day. I went from being an only to an oldest of three.
Whoa.
So,
wow. Yeah, that's a big adjustment. Yeah. And anyone that's lived through that knows that's a big adjustment for everybody. Yeah. That's huge. That's a big deal. Okay.
And I'm not sure we knew all the things back then that we know now about.
Well, and even the things we know now, we still end up not knowing things, it seems to me. I mean, because our church it should be calling is the bottom line, hopefully. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So then that sounds like church was a big part of growing up.
Yeah. Yeah. I grew up in a family that we just went to church at least 3 times a week. That's just how it was, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. Very much centered most of life around church. I never felt like it was in a weird way because, lots of people in our smallish towns did that. It's kind of the center of life. That's changed a lot, obviously.
Yeah.
But that's the way it was then. And I found, I was born on a Monday and my parents had me in church on Sunday. So my parents also went to church on their honeymoon, which is a whole story, right?
Wow. Okay. So all the way in. This is
all the way in.
This is what we do. Okay. Yeah, fair enough.
We didn't actually talk about faith all that much at home. My parents were, pretty not avoidant, just quiet about their own personal faith.
Interesting.
They were more or less quiet people anyway.
Right.
But yeah, church was where I learned to be a leader. It's where I learned to make friends. It's where I learned to, learned about my own personal relationship with God. I had the misfortune of being called into ministry around age 10, where no one had informed me that God didn't call girls into ministry.
Oh, wow.
And so that was kind of a tension through high school. And I went to a church college and, so it kind of continued to be a way of trying to figure out my calling was absolutely unmistakable.
Right.
And I had no idea what that would end up looking like.
Wow.
So I told my dad I wanted to be a pastor when I went to college. And he said, well, I think that's fine. And you might need something else. So I double majored in religion and psychology. And that psychology degree was what gave me access to being a counselor, went to seminary. And so kind of learned to live in 2 worlds and waited for the world to catch up to my calling. So
interesting. Okay. So what I'm hearing, and maybe I'm not hearing correctly, is that church was a positive thing, positive enough that you felt calling, and yet had sort of a mixed message in that, man, I really feel called, but then all of a sudden, wait a minute, I'm not allowed to do all the things.
Yeah.
So I found another door through counseling in college.
Yes. And learning that the church was so much bigger than my Southern Baptist church in a smallish community in Texas.
Yeah.
Went through a period where I went to my church with my family, but also walked down the street to an Assemblies of God church.
Oh, interesting.
And kind of got exposed to that way of life, went off to college and got exposed to more of a liturgical style, which I resonated with. So learning to see the capital C church helped a lot with that too.
Yeah, that is interesting. So you start to see different ways of doing expression. And you said you went to a Christian college.
Yeah, I went to Baylor.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
on purpose, you're like, this is where I'm going.
Yeah.
And when did the counseling therapy space start to feel like, man, maybe this is something I'm made for? Was it a class? Was it a experience? Was it what started to make that viable?
I wanted to process some of what was going on in my own family. And so I went to counseling my freshman year in college, and it changed my life. So that opened that up, right? To see the potential there.
Right.
And then we went to a pretty conservative seminary that has since become a lot more conservative, where women were kind of welcomed, but not all the way in. And so I stayed on the religion side of things and was resentful over there, but then found more freedom in the counseling program, but still really thought, I really resisted the idea of getting a state license and opening a practice. I still thought I would find my place in the church. And eventually did, obviously, the work I do now.
Right.
But that was a period of not knowing how the story was going to end and not really knowing what doors would be open to me. And then I also, during that time, we were babies. I had just turned 21 when I married my husband.
Oh, okay.
Who was on the more traditional track to be a pastor. We kind of figured out there wasn't a way. We weren't Methodist. There wasn't a way for both of us to be in that lane. And so I stepped into an adjacent lane and went the counseling direction.
Interesting. Okay. And then, saying that you're a counselor is like saying you're a pastor, in that there's so many ways to be either of those things.
Right.
So like, it's sort of like when somebody says to me, oh, don't worry, I'm in counseling. I'm always like, what kind of counseling? Like where was that person trained, or what kinds of things are you doing? It's the same as though if somebody says to me, oh, don't worry, I go to church.
Yeah. What does that mean?
Exactly. Which church, and what does it mean that you go to church, and like what? So when you think about even your track from sort of a heart for ministry into counseling, what kinds of counseling did you start to study, or were you attracted to? Because I know some of the work you do now, obviously. So we might just be a little geeky here for a minute.
Yeah,
there'd be like a small percentage of people that will track with us. So if you don't track with us, just hang on. We'll get back to some other stuff. But how did you start to frame up your thinking of what it means to do therapy or to be a clinician, or what were the different tracks that started to?
Yeah, I started not being drawn to wanting to be a clinician, and started very firmly with the identity of a pastoral counselor. And people mostly don't know what that means, but at least at the time, that was a discipline in counseling that explicitly brought together theology, faith, and counseling. You hear a lot about Christian counseling. Most Christian counselors don't necessarily have training in the spiritual life or in theology or have seminary degrees or whatever. And so that's not exactly considered an actual discipline in the field. And there's controversy about that.
Sure.
But pastoral counseling, had been around since like the 30s and had developed itself as a particular discipline. And I was very interested in that, and became a fellow in the Association of Pastoral Counselors and so forth. And then the state of Texas started requiring a license. And I had to make the decision. So what do I do here? And decided to go ahead and be licensed. And at the time, that was a challenging decision. But today, I would say that was absolutely the right thing to do. Counselors need to be licensed. And I don't know why we weren't licensing counselors before then.
Right.
And then that also gives your listeners an idea of how old I am, because, this was a long time ago. And then just joined a group practice I was mostly trained. You said we were going to geek out. I was mostly trained in cognitive behavioral style things.
Yep.
Got interested in Bowen theory. So if you know our books, particularly The Leader's Journey, all about Bowen theory.
Yep.
And then since then, I've tried to become more trauma informed, more holistic, particularly in terms of how the body fits into all of this.
Yep.
So
that's good. Okay. So it's worth just pausing a second to, I don't know if you and I, it's funny, we've talked a lot, but I don't know if you and I have talked about how Jim, who you've worked with a lot, and I first connected was...
I don't think so.
Okay, so this will be interesting to you, and it'll help us think about this next bit. So I meet Jim in some city movement stuff in New York City. So we're just at a gathering together.
Okay. I was on some of those trips.
Yes, you
so
were.
I may have met you then.
Yep. So we're sitting at a table, and as Jim would do, he just asked me, "Well, so what are you interested in? What are you excited about these days?" And I said, we don't know each other that well, so I'm not sure how much detail to go into. But what I would just say briefly is I'm just enamored with the thought of how spiritual formation and systems thinking lead to sort of missional living. Those three things they come together in a way that I don't quite know how to put my head around, but I have an intuition that that's what I want to give my life to. And we're sitting there at the table, and he looks at me and he goes, just like this, he goes, "Are you making fun of me right now?" And I said,
"That's awesome."
"No, I don't know. I'm not. I don't know. Why would you think that?" He says, "Well, I've written a book with my friend on this." I said, "Oh, really?" And so then we spent the whole rest of the time talking about that. I went back to my hotel and downloaded The Leader's Journey. And I read it till like 3 a.m. I read the whole thing.
Is that right?
And so then we walked in the meeting the next morning, and I said, "I read your book last night. Read the whole thing." He goes, "What?" I go, "I read the whole thing." And he goes, "How's that possible?" I go, I don't know. I just did it. I read the whole thing." And he looks at me, and we're in this little meeting. We're going to do this thing. Actually, it was with Tim Keller at the time. And he says, "Well, do you want to just walk out of this meeting? Let's just go walk and talk." I said, "Let's go." And we just left and walked around the city talking. So
that's great.
So some of the things you're describing were happening in my life, similar to you, through our own therapy process, through our own growth, reading Willard or knowing Foster and different stuff. So really similar pathways. You and Jim were way ahead in that you were writing books and things when I was just thinking about it. So super, super helpful to me.
Well, we definitely wrote that book while we were still thinking about it. I mean, one of the great things about a second edition is that they come to you and say, "So have you learned anything since then?" Right. And you get to add like 25% more material, and you get to take out the stuff that you figured out was wrong. And so,
Oh, that's good.
Because we were definitely just figuring it out at that time.
Well, and just to pause briefly, if anybody's not read that, you should definitely read that book, Leader's Journey. Great book. I've recommended it and given away everywhere I know how. I'll have to look if I have the new edition. I might have the old edition. But anyway, so
I'll send it to you.
That's very kind of you. Yeah. So I have to look. Like, wait a minute, there's new thoughts. I'd love to see those. So anyway, so you do all this different kind of clinical work. How did you start to work toward some of the work you do now? So how did you start to bump into thinking about leadership development in that? Because that's not necessarily what a clinician does. I can see it from your roots. You have this heart for pastors and church and ministry. So I can see how the story would lead you there. But what were some of the turning points? When did you start to go, how do we apply this in this context?
When we moved to Houston, I don't remember exactly how this happened, but pastors started not just referring to me, but then started to be referred to me.
I see.
And so my practice, which at that time I was part of a group practice, all of a sudden I have lots of congregational leaders pastors, missionaries, deacons, elders, all of that, and their families. And that just kind of became my lane. And then around that same time, Jim and some of the other people
Steve Capper.
Ken Schumann. Lots of others, James Furr, started putting together a program for pastors here in Houston that they called Leaders Edge. And I remember being invited to be part of the planning for Leaders Edge and saying, I just can't wait to, be there. And someone said, oh, well, this is just for pastors. It's just men. And I was like,
back to this.
Okay.
Yeah, right. Here we go again.
All right. Never mind. But
Right.
then about 2 or 3 years later, they'd done a couple of rounds of this and they invited me to be on the faculty. And that was just a terrific program for pastors. And they said, this absolutely changed our lives. And it didn't really change our churches.
Wow.
And so that led particularly Jim and some others down the path of asking the question, so what does that kind of change look like? And right about that time, Faith Walking was born. So you know about that, a discipleship process that focuses on inner work as well as missional living. And about that same time, we were invited to join and shape bi-denominational, bi-national process that lasted for about 10 years with over 100 churches, with a Lilly grant. And then I guess those two things together really just accelerated our learning about how do you bring together, personal spirituality, systems thinking, and exactly what you said, and then a life on mission.
Yeah.
So we had several years to learn what that looked like.
And so you're accessing this conversation through working with pastors. So you're like, I'm working with pastors. I'm watching the kinds of pressures and pains they're processing.
And I'm married to a pastor.
And you're married to a pastor, watching that up close.
Right.
And you're probably bearing witness to that feedback of, we're changing, but our churches aren't changing. So you're probably, you're seeing that in your office, maybe even in your home. And so then you start getting curious with them, going, why is that? What's going on? How do we jump that hurdle? Or how are these things related? What is and isn't working? So you're seeing that from a very clear vantage point. What did you start to identify as, like, what are the hurdles? What's going on that we're not getting from leaders to systems? Because, my experience working with Jim, for example, was that Jim also saw it the other way around. So we're building big programs where we're getting kids tutoring and we're growing churches even. But that the load limit is with the leaders. If the leaders aren't changing, it doesn't matter how much stuff we get done. That's going to be the break point. So I know, because I was in the city movement stuff, though. I'm watching him doing that from that side. You're watching from the other side. Man, we're seeing transformation in leaders, but they're not sure how to translate that into their work. So the pressure's coming from both directions.
That's true.
What did you start to notice? Like, well, here's some of the hurdles. Here's what's not quite working.
Well, I would say I started to notice this after other people started pointing to it.
Okay.
But our content didn't really change, and it still hasn't. Most of our content has stayed pretty consistent over time. I think the things that started to change were, first of all, the pastor couldn't just go back and deliver this to the congregation because it was rooted in experience.
Yeah.
And so we had to find a way to involve people in the congregation in the experience. For example, pastors needed to bring their teams, and those teams needed to experience what the pastor was experiencing. And the pastor could still lead the team through it, but was kind of leading as a player coach.
Yeah.
You had to turn way up the volume on authenticity. That there just was not a way to do that without vulnerability and authenticity, learning in public, starting to say the things out loud. We had groups start by just telling their stories. And it was so interesting. We'd have a church in a little town that would come back to us and say, we have literally known each other all our lives. We have lived in this little town since we were born. We all went to school together. We thought we knew each other's stories. But when you asked us to share our stories, we learned, even though we had lived in proximity to each other all our lives, we didn't know who each other were.
Yeah.
And, just to see that, and that was really the accelerant, was the authenticity. And then, of course, in faith walking, authenticity is a core value.
Yeah.
And so if I had to choose one thing, I think that's the thing that I would put there. It was really strong content, which it still is.
Yeah.
But also this idea that kind of vulnerability and authenticity is not optional.
Yeah. Yeah. And I find listening to you, pastors, especially if they're lead pastors, have a tendency to believe that information brings transformation. So I've had this incredible experience maybe with this coaching relationship / this process I've been in. And so I've written a really great sermon on differentiation and another great sermon on triangulation. And I have a third sermon on emotional anxiety, multi-generational process of anxious behavior, whatever. And I'm so pumped for this series. It's going to be amazing. It's going to change everything. And so they stand up there and they tell their stories, and it's maybe they're really authentic. And they do all this stuff, and they maybe even have a discussion group on the back of it that discusses the concept, and maybe even read a book. And yet pastors are going, nothing happened. This didn't work. And it's fundamentally because the information, though an important part, isn't a process. So it doesn't involve people in a way of being together. So talk a little bit more about that, because as I make this joke right now, some pastor is taking notes on this podcast going, this is going to be great for my sermon. And so talk about how that process is important, that way of doing authenticity, because you said they learned each other's stories, for example. What kinds of, if you have a lot of pastors probably listening to you right now, how do we help people work through a process as opposed to just give them ideas or content?
Well, I think we have to go back to Jesus, first of all. And I'm sure Dallas Willard was not the first one to say this, but he was the first person I heard say that, the way Jesus discipled was to make his disciples apprentices of a way of life. And, the book of Mark definitely loves to use that word, and then immediately they did such and such, and then immediately they did such and such else. And it makes you laugh. But actually, there were long walks between all those places where they went. And there were nights around the campfire. And there were the stresses of paying taxes and figuring out what to eat. And I think, so we go back to Jesus and kind of the way he led by saying, okay, watch what I'm doing. Now you go do it and come back and talk to me about it. And I think that idea of, we can't show up as experts. We want to show up as experts. But if we can invite the pastor, the team, us as facilitators, everyone in the room to show up instead as learners, And then if we have an idea of, you referenced this a minute ago, but if we have a way of understanding learning as, yes, getting all the content and the information, because that is important. If we don't have new information, we don't have anything to drive change.
Right.
But then also finding ways to go practice that and to risk, to learn in public, to fail, to be bad at something, and then to reflect with other people about it and to go around and around that cycle again and again is how transformation happens.
Yeah.
The only other way transformation happens for adults is that something comes into your life that just completely dismantles who you are.
Yep.
And you have to rebuild.
Yep.
And most of us, I mean, we deal with it when that comes, but we don't want to create that. So the only other way to do it is to do those little disruptions of learning and practicing and reflecting and learning and practicing and reflecting.
Okay, so let's go in order there for a second. So you've sat with pastors in clinical contexts. You've worked with congregations. My hunch is, much like anybody does any profession, you see patterns, right? So if I'm a salesperson, I know the objections people have. I know when then they're going to ask how much it costs. I know the other products that are competing with my product. I know it because I do it enough times. When you think about pastors, what they're up against, what leaders are up against, what are some themes that you see that you're like, when I meet a pastor, I can almost always guarantee that X is probably operating under the surface, or Y is a lie they're fighting against, or Z is a and I'm asking you to stereotype, which I know nobody likes to do, but you've done this enough times. You kind of know when I get the phone call. Okay, hey, I'm so-and-so, and I've been referred.
Right.
My hunch is I'm going to explore a few of these categories with them. What kinds of things are you aware of and or that you've seen like, yeah, these are some things that they can start to work on that produces change or transformation in their life?
I'm going to assume that they are living at a pace that doesn't sustain their souls. That's not unique to pastors. That's everywhere. But most people, if you work at the local school or the local hospital, you're not expected to sustain your soul. Pastors are. And my assumption is going to be you're living at a pace, your soul is hungry and empty. I'm going to assume that you probably got into ministry, apart from the call, that because you wanted to help people or because you wanted to run things. And it helps if you kind of know which of those categories, how you were shaped into being a pastor. Because that'll give you some insight into why you're frustrated or why you feel like things are not working. I'm going to assume that you probably haven't really taken out your mental models about church and looked at them in a while, or about yourself, or about how change happens. Because you came out of seminary with a set of mental models, which most of us would say most of the time don't work anymore. They are not models that were formed for the world we live in today.
Right.
And you may even know that, but you haven't known how or haven't had the space to stop and look at what your mental models are, those deeply held assumptions that you hold about how the world works and how change works and how people work and, all the things you're spending 60 hours a week doing.
Yep.
And that the thought of doing that is terrifying.
Yeah.
Because who knows what might be on the other side of that. And nowadays, I'm going to assume that your congregation is experiencing a level of anxiety that it is somewhere between embers and on fire.
Mm-hmm.
Since in the last, let's say, 8 years, 10 years, 6 years, our congregations we've caught the anxiety in the culture, and we've stirred up some of our own. And pastors are trying to lead systems that are on fire or will be soon, in denominations that are on fire, in communities that are on fire. And, I'm not saying that is brand new. I've thought some about what would it have been like to be a pastor in 1968?
Totally.
Or
yes.
1940, right? Like, what would that have been like? It's not like we've never been here before, but we are definitely here now.
Yes. That's good. Okay. So each one of those I would like to spend 10 to 15 hours talking to you about, but we are not afforded that opportunity. So what I also wonder is what do you assume, and maybe you don't assume anything about this because maybe it's not consistent, but what do you assume about their relational health? Because we talked about some of the pressures that are against them and what you described there, and or how they have been formed and what they're doing about that. What are you seeing as far as like how pastors think about themselves by way of friendship or having leaders in their own life or therapists or even in their marriages? How do they, what's your observation? Or is it maybe not consistent? Maybe it depends on their temperament or their context, or what would you notice?
Yeah, I would say a whole range. It's really interesting. We'll go in to work with pastors in a particular region, for example. And you see in that region the whole range. From pastors who really have a mental model that I have to go this alone. I mean, I was literally taught in a seminary class, you cannot have friends in your church. So there's that mental model that I'm kind of the Lone Ranger and I've got to do this by myself, all the way to, and I think this is more likely to be younger pastors, but that might not be right. I think that's true. They have a coach, they have a spiritual director, they have a group of friends, they have colleagues that, and they're really pretty relationally connected. And, have people both in and outside their church that they are, sharing their lives with. And so that whole range.
That's good.
And yet all of them are in these systems that are on fire in jobs that tend to be lonely.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, that's good. Okay. That would be my assumption too. That's why I was just curious how you'd see that. And then that idea of pulling some of your mental models out and looking at them. So, okay, I was taught in seminary or in training or by the previous church I was in, whatever.
Or even the Bible says.
Yeah, the Bible says, right. This is how people change. This is what a good pastor does. This is what a healthy church looks like.
Yeah.
If you're a pastor going, yeah, gosh, I'm not even sure what you're saying right now. I don't know how to be. How does somebody begin into that process? Because I think most pastors I know that what they're doing isn't working, in quotes. They know this is not producing what I think it's supposed to produce. I don't know what to do now. So I guess I could read a book. I go to a conference that offers us some new thoughts. So I come home with my notebook. I run that play for a few months. And then I wonder, wait a minute, this doesn't seem right.
Yeah.
What have you
My
found
elders
to be most...
accuse me of flavor of the month.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's right. So what do you think, what have you found to be helpful to begin to help someone start to explore, first of all, just even what is going on inside of them, let alone what might be some new adaptations?
I might throw out there 2 mental models that I think are really, really common that people are assuming are true, and just ask people to test their own thinking alongside this. So here are 2. If I'm a good leader, people will be happy. The people I lead will be happy. And if I'm a good leader, the people I lead will willingly follow me. And I think those are 2 mental models that most of us come into ministry with. And, some of the folks that talk to us about systems thinking remind us that actually systems tend to push back against good leadership, tend to sabotage good leadership. And that some of the resistance that we see maybe is that we're not leading that great, but also is definitely the systems don't like to change. And that if we are good leaders, we will see resistance. And I see people try that idea on, and it is so different from how they have been living. This mental model that if I'm a good leader, people are going to be happy and they're going to follow me willingly. To actually, if I'm a good leader, I'm going to provoke sabotage and resistance. That's a huge shift. It takes a while to even just try that on. And I use that language on purpose, to just try it on. Like you would walk around in a pair of shoes and see if they fit. Just try it on in meetings, try it on in your devotional time, try it on, when you're writing sermons, and just see, is there something here that fits? And if there is, then practice the idea that, I'm coming up against some resistance. Maybe this isn't personal. Maybe this is because the system is reacting to being challenged in a new way. And how can I see this through? And that's where I would point people to the work of Todd Bolsinger. I mean, so much Todd Bolsinger. I have a quote of his on my marker board, just right over here, that says, once you have discerned the direction to lead, stay calm, stay connected, stay the course. And that requires a mental model that says, I can tolerate people not liking me right now.
Yes.
I can tolerate some sabotage or resistance. And I can stay connected to those people without demonizing them. I can stay calm without feeling like I'm going to die if people don't like me. Or I may feel like I'm going to die, but I can at least tolerate that feeling, right? Yeah. And just keep moving forward at a pace that people can stand.
Well, that in and of itself is probably feels impossible to a certain percentage of people that we're talking to right now. They're listening. They're like, that feels impossible. Because again, when you line that up against what you said earlier, which is I got into ministry because I want to help people, which is often code for I want them to like me.
Sure.
And or B, so I can be in charge, which is also code for I can feel in control. So and now you're saying, wait a minute, what I actually got in it to do was to upset people and have them sabotage my control. You're saying that is the sign I'm leading effectively. Therefore, it's blowing the circuit. The circuit was designed so that I could feel loved and important and in control. And both of those things are going to be tested if I lead effectively.
And that's when you get into coaching or therapy. I mean, right. But you don't do that by yourself, I guess is my point.
Yes.
And so,
yes.
But also, so a book is not going to solve things, but Steve Costa's book, Managing Leadership Anxiety, and Bolsinger's, all of Bolsinger's books.
Yes.
What they do is give you stories so that you can get an idea of what that looks like. I mean, if you really want someone to come and just like stomp on all your assumptions, also Edwin Friedman's book, A Failure of Nerve, will do that.
Totally. Yes.
But I think that's where you kind of get the picture of, okay, that's what this kind of leadership looks like.
Yes.
And I either want to do that, and so I'll learn how to do it, or I didn't sign up for that, and I'm going to go do something else. You know?
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah,
which is a totally legitimate thing to decide.
It totally is. No, and I've told this story more than once, so it'll be boring to other people, but I think you might find it fun. Is when we were starting our church plant, I met with a whole bunch of other church planters with this kind of older, wiser guy that planted all these churches. And we're sitting at the table, and he says, go around and just tell me what you guys are dealing with. And first guy's like, man, we don't have any money, and we have these clear things, but we can't pay for anything. And then the people say they're going to give, don't, and da-da-da. Next person, man, so much betrayal, and the people we came with and it went wrong. And next person, well, we had this really clear vision, but then, there's all this resistance, and so then we had to change, and the other person, my marriage is da-da-da. So it's just going around. It's all the classic, here's what's hard. And it gets back to him finally. He says, oh, man, this is really hard, guys. This is hard. And, man, there's not a single thing you guys are talking about that I've not personally experienced. And I've got great news for you. There's not a thing that you've talked about that Jesus did not experience. Every single thing you're talking about, we can read in the New Testament. And he took a deep breath. He says, this is the part you're not going to like. This is the work. This is it.
Yeah.
He said, so if you don't want to do this work, you probably need another job. And here's what I want to tell you. If you work in an ER and you're stunned at the sight of blood, like you come home after working a few shifts in the ER and you go, there's so much blood. What did you think this was? What did you think we were doing? Did you think you were going to work in the ER and you weren't going to see any blood? I know many of you got into ministry thinking you were doing Bible teaching, you were praying, you were walking in the hills considering God's call for people's life. I'm so sorry. This is it. This is it right here. And you get to do the other things too. So don't get me wrong. Those things aren't eliminated. But this is where the rubber meets the road. And it might mean this isn't what you want to do. And I just remember sitting there at that table. I'm whatever I am. I'm 25. And thinking, wait a minute. Hold on.
Right?
Time out. I can tell looking in this guy's eyes, he's saying something that's true. This is not shock value. He's telling me something that's true. And I remember sitting at that table thinking, I'm going to have to rewire what I look for. And, even with pastors, I'm often like, if you don't get any resistance to what you say, you might need to wonder if you're actually leading.
Yeah.
Like you have to attune your eyes to notice that certain kinds of criticism should encourage you because it means you're challenging assumptions. Like if somebody's like, man, what you're asking is really hard, a light should go off in your mind like, ooh, wow, I actually did something today. If you don't ever hear that, you might want to wonder, am I even leading at all? Or am I just managing and placating what people want? So coaching, counseling, you're saying the right kinds of things. I don't think the culture is going to change. So you're saying we're catching some of that heat. So as a pastor, I'm starting to rewire how I'm thinking. What are you noticing that pastors that are leading effectively are doing in their congregations to help people with this kind of work? Is it kind of this work and then they're just creating those assumptions? We talked about maybe creating some pathways for authenticity and being actually, what other kinds of things would you say to a pastor? Here's how you build a more resilient leadership team or congregation.
Well, first of all, they're working on themselves.
Yes.
I mean, that's just absolutely essential.
Yep.
And of course, churches are different and pastors are different. But one of the things that they're doing is that they're seeing this kind of growth as a developmental process, right? So, so here's where the church is now in terms of its emotional maturity and resilience. And here's where we want to go. And they have some kind of idea of helping the church walk step by step.
Yes.
What often happens, maybe less mature leadership, and I've done this myself, is to get into the pulpit and tell people how terrible they are for not being more emotionally mature.
Oof, yeah.
Right? Rather than to kind of have a sense that, okay, here's where we are. Maybe on a scale of 1 to 10, we're at a 3. Well, what takes us to 3.5? What takes us to 4? Rather than to say, okay, we're at a 3. So I need to find the magic or the quick fix or the thing that will make us look like 8, right? To use your example about the ER, I'll take a similar example. Some pastors are preschool teachers. They are in a congregation where, the capacity is pretty low.
Yeah.
Their people really haven't even learned how to tie their shoes yet.
Yeah.
And to treat a preschool class as if it's, as if they're juniors in high school would be cruel. And it would just frustrate everybody.
Yes.
But at the same time, a good preschool teacher is preparing her children or his children for kindergarten.
Yeah.
Right? The idea is, but next year you're going to kindergarten. So this is what you need to get to kindergarten. And I think pastors that are really effective are thinking developmentally like that. Instead of thinking maybe more programmatically or, in terms of how do I either shove or drag these people to, a different way of being. So I think that's really, really important.
If you're interested in more of the work Vineyard USA is doing to promote healthy pastors and leaders, we'd encourage you to check out the Pastoral Health Information page on our website. Go to vineyardusa.org/pastoral health to learn about resources, upcoming cohorts, and support from the Vineyard USA team.
Yeah, in dealing with idealism, what I find so hard with kind of catalytic type pastors, because not all pastors fit that mold, is they've heard the one sermon or been to the one church or been in the one leadership team. So you're in somebody else's leadership team, you're like, whoa, there's so much energy here. There's so much life. There's so much vitality. And they come back to their team and go, guys, listen to this. And they inadvertently crush their team. I'm definitely guilty of this.
Me too.
They crush their team. Their team's like, I was just trying to get through whatever this is. There's some world in which we're gonna end homelessness in our city or whatever. What are you trying to do to us? Why are you doing this to us? Now I just feel worse. Yeah. So I agree with you. That's really hard. And I don't think the culture, it doesn't look like it's going to calm down any time soon. There isn't any sense that it's going to do that. So we can't hope that everything's going to change around us. So what would you want to say if I'm in a church and I'm hearing you? How do I support or help my pastor in this? So I'm not a pastor, but I'm on a leadership team, or I'm an elder, or I attend a church. And maybe even as I'm listening to you, I'm going, oh my goodness, I think I'm part of the problem. I'm the one that sent that upset email, and I'm just adding to whatever my poor pastor's trying to manage. What
Mhm.
how am I a helpful part of the system when I'm not in charge? What
Yeah.
do I do that brings life?
Well, there's some basic things like make sure your pastor is paid a living wage, make sure they have enough PTO, if they, that they're on track for a sabbatical, that
Yep.
if they need time off to deal with a family crisis, that y'all can,
Just
make
give it
that
to them.
happen,
Right.
give
Yep.
it to them, all of that. I mean,
Mhm.
just fundamental, foundational things about treating people humanely.
Mm.
When your pastor sets boundaries, support those.
Mm.
Right. I don't know how many times. It doesn't happen as much anymore because Craig is older and sets better boundaries. And I think the culture knows more about boundaries. But how many times in the old days you would get that call? I know it's your day off, but,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. And so, don't ever walk up to your pastor to talk to them about something during the greeting time on Sunday morning. Right. Like that is just awful to do to someone. So there's some small things like that.
Right.
But if your pastor is a leader, is a learner, open up to that, right? I mean, deal with kind of your own internal resistance.
Yeah.
Not to be the favorite or the teacher's pet, but just to say, okay, maybe there's something here, even though this is unfamiliar.
Yeah.
I'm going to be open. I'm going to learn more, and I'm going to encourage other people. When people come to me in the congregation and say, yeah, about my pastor, I'm going to say, yeah, it's hard to change. Here's what I'm working on because this is not an easy change for me too. Rather than joining in that sabotage or opposing the sabotage. That's not always really helpful either. I support the pastor no matter what.
Right.
Well, that's not helpful.
Yeah.
But just to talk about the way you're engaging with the discomfort of change. Those triangles, and I'm not going to unpack that whole idea, but the triangle between you, the pastor, and other people, you really want to handle those well.
Yeah.
Right. So that you're not involved in gossip, but you're also not irrelevant to the conversation either.
Yes, that's right.
If you know your pastor is in unhealthy territory, and often elders know, or deacons know, or, staff know, but they don't know what to do. Don't just let that go. Be the person that has the courage to go to the pastor, to go to the denominational entity, if there is one, to look for solutions. No one is going to come up to you and thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
It is not going to happen because it's going to be disruptive and people will resent it.
Yeah.
But there's a chance that you can get ahead of it before everything is carnage.
Yes.
And I think that's a very important role for top level congregational leaders to play. Put accountability structures in place. But, I also know, I love this story. I know it kind of close up. This didn't happen to my husband. I should probably say that. But it did happen to someone I actually know, where after hiring this young pastor, the leadership of this congregation realized this guy doesn't know how to preach. He's terrible. The church is pushing back on that, and we made a mistake. And we're going to need to just move him out and find somebody who knows how to preach.
Yeah.
And instead, what they did, and I would have loved to have been in this meeting, but to say to the pastor, you need some skills here, and here's some money, and we're ready to be patient.
Yeah.
But this is a skill you've got to learn, and we're here to support you as you do that. How often does that happen? Not
really
very
rarely.
often, I don't think.
Yes, very rare.
But that pastor stayed there a while and was beloved when he left. So I just think thinking in terms of solutions and not just, we just have to gut this out with this pastor till they leave, or we've got to force this pastor out.
Yes.
I think if lay leaders can think creatively and also lead.
That's good. Yeah. And I was just talking with a pastor who's retiring. I said, if you could tell yourself one thing, you could go back and talk to yourself, what would you want to say? And because I found him to be, healthy person, had worked on his own life. He said, Jay, if I could tell myself one thing, I only get one, I would want to tell myself how much transference is at play in nearly every conversation I'm in as a pastor. That I represent something to every person I'm talking to. And that the majority of the time it's not personal.
Absolutely.
Like it's very rarely personal. And when I mean rarely, I mean less than 1%.
Wow, that's a low number.
Yeah, he said really low. He says, whereas I think as a young pastor, and frankly, even through probably the middle of my career, I was thinking it was like 70% was personal. Like you're saying something about me. When often they're saying something about something I'm doing or not doing. But even that's a lower percentage than you think. It's nearly always the person's talking to me saying, you represent something that I don't know how to deal with.
Yeah.
I don't know how to deal with your authority. I don't know how to deal with the fact that you remind me or feel like my dad, my older brother, my sister who's always telling me I'm not good enough.
Yeah.
And even when they're fawning on me, they're telling me I'm amazing. They're not actually telling me I'm amazing. They're
right.
They're
That's
managing.
not as personal as we'd like to believe either.
Exactly. And he said, and if I could tell myself that, I think I would have saved myself a ton of work that I didn't have to do. I know you're with pastors a lot. And you're doing this kind of work. How much of that makes sense to you? When I say that to you, how do pastors attend to that? Like I'm not actually dealing with someone talking to me. They're talking to my position. They're talking to some other thing that person's trying to figure out. How do people attenuate? And you have to do that as a therapist, right? So, what I find fascinating is how many clinicians have been trained in a bunch of things that pastors have not been trained in.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
This would be one of those things. Like clinicians have to learn this. You've been taught this.
It's still hard.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But most pastors haven't been. Most pastors, this is a brand new thought.
Don't even know this.
Right.
Yeah.
How do you manage even as maybe a clinician, or how would you help pastors think about that?
So first of all, I think you're absolutely right. I might put the number a little higher, because sometimes people really are reacting to mistakes we've made, or to ways that we have not been gentle with them, or ways that we have, things we still have to learn about leadership. And I see a lot of leaders who see anybody who brings that to them and holds a mirror up to them about that, they get very defensive.
Yes.
And so I do want leaders to be open to the possibility that there might be something they see that I don't.
Yeah, or you messed up.
That is about me.
Yep.
But once we have been willing to set the defensiveness aside, and by the way, if I could just flip a switch on leaders, that would be the flip I would switch from defensiveness to curiosity. That's the game changer. But then I would say, yeah, it's so much of this is not personal. And I remember a guy saying, and I say this to pastors all the time, to leaders all the time. And I remember a guy coming to me and just saying, you just don't know. I'm in my office. This guy comes in, he's got his, finger in my chest and he's screaming at me. And like people in other parts of the building are coming in to see, and he's cussing me out, and tell me that's not personal. And I said, that sounds really, really painful and awful, and I'm sorry. But if you weren't the pastor of this church in that office, would that conversation have happened? And he said, no, it wouldn't have. And I said, that's what I mean by it's not personal.
Yes. And what do you do about that?
I mean, it's hard, right? We're back to the blood on the floor in the ER, right?
It's hard.
I think it does make a huge difference to remember that, as Todd Bolsinger says, they don't tackle the quarterback because they hate him. They tackle him because he has the ball.
Right.
And, I think it's very important to remember that.
Yes.
And it does help. And then you can get together with your friends and kind of remind each other of that and talk that through. But does it ever stop hurting? I mean, no.
No, yeah.
And it's just hard.
Yeah, and I think, I learned, and I'm sure you helped write this in the faith walking language now we use it emotionally focused, is the idea of getting into the balcony of your own life. Like, can I, maybe not in the moment, it's hard to do in the moment. You can learn to do it in the moment, but it's hard to do immediately in the moment. But maybe at least after the fact, can I just act like I'm standing to the side of this? I'm watching this interaction. I'm watching what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling, and I'm observing it. And if I can keep this thought in my mind, what if this isn't personal?
Yeah.
What if this person's working out their own pain? What if this person's asking you to change a behavior? They're not. They're not attacking the essence of who you are. They're saying, there's a way you behave that I would prefer you behave differently, and or the way you behave needs some repair. That hurt me. And there's some ways you could repair that. And you're just watching through those lenses.
Yeah.
You learn things pretty fast, just watching yourself. And then, of course, if you have a coach, you have a therapist, all the more, because they actually are standing at the side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So all of that, remembering that some people are coming to you and saying, you're a terrible person, or I'm making you responsible for me in a way that no person should be asked to be responsible for another person, etc.
Yes.
So I love what you're saying. That idea of the balcony, I think, comes before us. It comes from Ronald Heifetz and Ron Linsky and their work, but Marty Linsky, sorry. I would also say, yes, that's so important. It's crucial. That's the reflection, right? In the information practice reflection cycle. But I also want to say, cry, go for a run. Yeah. Like, just scream it out in the shower. Whatever you need to do, because you also are going to have just a visceral human bodily reaction to that. And that's okay too. Yeah. But once you're done with that, get up to the balcony and try to see it for what it is and not just what it felt like. Yeah. That's good. That's really good. Okay. So one last thing. Let's do one more thing. Okay. So you've been around Vineyard folks a decent amount. So, and we're our own unique, amazing and hard things, I imagine. What would you want to say just from what your experience has been? Like, here's something I see unique that is a gift that you bring, and here's a challenge that I can see in just having now worked with different sets of Vineyard folks. Do you have anything specific? Oh, okay. Good. Because I come home every time I'm with Vineyard people, and the thing that I say to Craig is, these people act like God is really real. Like, they really... If God is really real, Vineyard people act like that. I love it. It is my favorite thing about being with the Vineyard. That I come away feeling like there is a rich authenticity that says, we believe God is real, and because we believe that, we're going to stop and talk to him. Or we're going to, we're going to assume that prayer has some kind of effect. I remember reading some research about the Vineyard, and some secular research. And one of the things I loved about what the researchers said was, the Vineyard people pray as if they can just say what they want to say to God and then trust God to handle it. They're not shy about asking for what they want, but they also don't try to pin God down and force him to give it to them. And that has completely been my experience.
Hmm.
I come away enriched every time, even when I'm with Vineyard churches that are in very painful circumstances. I come away enriched by that. So that's the first thing that came to my mind when
That's
you asked.
encouraging. Yeah. Well, and yeah, I believe that's true. And what do you think? Like, what do you think are some unique challenges? Like, hey, keep your eye on this, Vineyard. Be thoughtful as a pastor. Be thoughtful as a leader.
Oh, okay. I'm going to tell you what I think, and I have no idea if this dovetails with what you think or not.
Okay,
So,
great. I'm excited. That makes it exciting. Yeah.
But I think that the very loose structures of accountability and lots of authority in the pastor allowed the Vineyard to be nimble and to grow quickly and to, have lots of rapid growth in the early years. That was absolutely God's plan. And it also opened up some vulnerabilities.
Yep.
That when we put all that authority in one person, that can be traumatic. It can be unfair to the person, and it can be traumatic for the church if things go badly.
Yep.
And even if you have a healthy person in that role, that puts too much pressure on them. And it allows the church to underfunction in some ways. And it makes the church vulnerable to the weaknesses of the pastor. So that's what I would say about that.
No, that's good. Well, and as you know, that's some of the work we're doing presently. We're trying to attenuate some of that. But you're right. If that's in the DNA, that takes some different kind of work to turn that wheel, to see that.
Yeah, and there's a loss there because a congregation where more people share authority and where accountability is always present, it's going to move slower. It's going to feel cumbersome. It's going to require different strengths. And it's not that there was anything wrong with the way that it was done before.
Right.
It has kind of an apostolic flavor and allowed the Vineyard to be exactly who they needed to be at that time.
Yep.
So
That's
it's a
good.
balance.
It is. Yeah. Yeah. And I think the language we've started using is most vineyards have a good peacetime way of behaving, but a bad wartime way of behaving. So as long as things are all going well, like the pastor's the healthiest they can be, the momentum of things are going, like we're seeing people come to Christ, we're seeing prayer powerful, those are being generous with their money. Man, we're built well because we can move quick, we can react, we can respond, we can celebrate. Well, what happens if something goes wrong? The pastor gets sick, an elder goes through a divorce, the person we thought was going to get healed dies. Now what? Well, we're not quite as prepared for that because we don't know how to diffuse that authority in a way that we can respond to that. It's harder. I had one clinician who I've worked with said about you've been in the Vineyard lot, said, you guys have really high expectations of what God can do, which is incredible. That's called faith. You also love to work with broken people. You accept everybody. The combination of those two things means that you're going to hit a wall at some point. So you have really high expectations, you believe everything can work, and you're working with people that are really, really broken. At some point, one of those things is going to collide with the other thing. And that's when you find out, what are you going to do? And what that does, it puts pressure specifically on pastors. Because they feel a ton of dissonance. We believe everyone can play. We believe that God works with the most broken. We believe that we're supposed to change the world. And we're supposed to do all that.
Yeah.
And people let you down, or you find a flaw, and everyone turns and looks at you and says, well, now what are we going to do? And you don't know. So you're highly idealistic and you're very compassionate. That's a really hard tension to live in without processes that can attenuate things when things go wrong. And we've been working on that. But you're right, there is loss in that.
There is.
There is loss. There's real change there. Yeah, that's really good. Those are great observations and very, very, very affirming, very encouraging. Well, you've given us a lot of time.
Yeah.
Like I said, I have 9 more hours.
Oh, absolutely.
These
topic. Are fun conversations.
Per topic, what you said there. And I just can't tell you, Trisha, how grateful I am for you. The work you've done extends way beyond what you could probably be aware of. And it's enriched my life personally, and then also our movement. So I'm really, really grateful for you and your work. And I know every leader I know it costs them in ways that other people don't get to know. So I'm really grateful. I'm sure it's cost you a lot, but I'm richer for it.
Thank you. Maybe, but I think I can honestly say I've enjoyed every minute I've worked with the Vineyard. It has felt special. So I'm glad that that's mutual.
It is. Oh boy, is it. Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear it is. Well, I'll bother you again another time.
Okay.
It sounds like you committed to talking to me more. So we're on public record. So I
okay. Absolutely. Anytime. That's great.
As we celebrate our 50-year anniversary in the Vineyard, if you're interested in learning more about Vineyard history, there are plenty of resources for you. Check out our show notes for links to books, YouTube videos, and more to learn about Vineyard history and identity. And make sure to keep listening to the podcast this year for stories of Vineyard churches throughout the year.